Chapter 5, Part 1 of Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 5, Tanith. After leaving the gardens, Matho and Spendius found themselves checked by the rampart of Megara. But they discovered a breach in the great wall and passed through. The ground sloped downwards, forming a kind of very broad alley. It was an exposed place. "Listen," said Spendius, "and first of all fear nothing. I shall fulfil my promise." He stopped abruptly, and seemed to reflect as though searching for words. "Do you remember that time at sunrise when I showed Carthage to you on Salammbô's terrace? We were strong that day, but you would listen to nothing." Then in a grave voice: "Master, in the sanctuary of Tanith there is a mysterious veil which fell from heaven and which covers the goddess." "I know," said Matho. Spendius resumed: "It is itself divine, for it forms part of her. The gods reside where their images are. It is because Carthage possesses it that Carthage is powerful." Then, leaning over to his ear: "I have brought you with me to carry it off." Matho recoiled in horror. "Begone! Look for someone else. I will not help you in this execrable crime." "But Tanith is your enemy," retorted Spendius. "She is persecuting you, and you are dying through her wrath. You will be revenged upon her. She will obey you, and you will become almost immortal and invincible." Matho bent his head. Spendius continued: "We should succumb. The army would be annihilated of itself. We have neither flight nor succour, nor pardon to hope for. What chastisement from the gods can you be afraid of, since you will have their power in your own hands? Would you rather die on the evening of a defeat, in misery beneath the shelter of a bush, or amid the outrages of the populace and the flames of funeral piles? Master, one day you will enter Carthage among the colleges of the pontiffs, who will kiss your sandals, and if the veil of Tanith weighs upon you still, you will reinstate it in its temple. Follow me! Come and take it!" Matho was consumed by a terrible longing. He would have liked to possess the veil while refraining from the sacrilege. He said to himself that perhaps it would not be necessary to take it in order to monopolize its virtue. He did not go to the bottom of his thought, but stopped at the boundary, where it terrified him. "Come on," he said, and they went off with rapid strides, side by side and without speaking. The ground rose again, and the dwellings were near. They turned again into the narrow street amid the darkness. The strips of esparto grass with which the doors were closed beat against the walls. Some camels were ruminating in a square before heaps of cut grass. Then they passed beneath a gallery covered with foliage. A pack of dogs were barking. But suddenly the space grew wider, and they recognized the western face of the Acropolis. At the foot of Byrsa there stretched a long black mass. It was the temple of Tanith, a hall made up of monuments and galleries, courts and forecourts, and bounded by a low wall of dry stones. Spendius and Matho leaped over it. This first barrier enclosed a wood of plane trees as a precaution against plague and infection in the air. Tents were scattered here and there, in which, during the daytime, depilatory pastes, perfumes, garments, moon-shaped cakes, and images of the goddess with representations of the temple hollowed out in blocks of alabaster were on sale. They had nothing to fear, for on nights when the planet did not appear, all rites were suspended. Nevertheless, Matho slackened his speed, and stopped before the 3 ebony steps leading to the second enclosure. "Forward!" said Spendius. Pomegranate, almond trees, cypresses, and myrtles alternated in regular succession. The path, which was paved with blue pebbles, creaked beneath their footsteps, and full-blown roses formed a hanging bower over the whole length of the avenue. They arrived before an oval hall, protected by a grating. Then Matho, who was frightened by the silence, said to Spendius, "It is here that they mix the fresh water and the bitter." "I have seen all that," returned the former slave, "in Syria, in the town of Mafug," and they ascended into the third enclosure by a staircase of 6 silver steps. A huge cedar occupied the centre. Its lowest branches were hidden beneath scraps of material, and necklaces hung upon them by the faithful. They walked a few steps further on, and the front of the temple was displayed before them. 2 long porticos, with their architraves resting on dumpy pillars, flanked a quadrangular tower, the platform of which was adorned with the crescent of a moon. On the angles of the porticos and at the 4 corners of the tower stood vases filled with kindled aromatics. The capitals were laden with pomegranates and coloquintidas. Twining knots, lozenges, and rows of pearls alternated on the walls, and a hedge of silver filigree formed a wide semicircle in front of the brass staircase which led down from the vestibule. There was a cone of stone at the entrance between a stela of gold and one of emerald, and Matho kissed his right hand as he passed beside it. The first room was very lofty. Its vaulted roof was pierced by numberless apertures, and if the head were raised the stars might be seen. All round the wall rush baskets were heaped up with the first fruits of adolescence in the shape of beards and curls of hair, and in the centre of the circular apartment the body of a woman issued from a sheath which was covered with breasts. Fat, bearded, and with eyelids downcast, she looked as though she were smiling, while her hands were crossed upon the lower part of her big body, which was polished by the kisses of the crowd. Then they found themselves again in the open air, in a transverse corridor, wherein there was an altar of small dimensions leaning against an ivory door. There was no further passage, the priests alone could open it, for the temple was not a place of meeting for the multitude, but the private abode of a divinity. "The enterprise is impossible," said Matho. "You had not thought of this. Let us go back." Spendius was examining the walls. He wanted the veil, not because he had confidence in its virtue. Spendius believed only in the oracle, but because he was persuaded that the Carthaginians would be greatly dismayed on seeing themselves deprived of it. They walked all around behind in order to find some outlet. Edicules of different shapes were visible beneath clusters of turpentine trees. Here and there rose a stone phallus, and large stags roamed peacefully about, spurning the fallen fir cones with their cloven hoofs. But they retraced their steps between two long galleries which ran parallel to each other. There were small open cells along their sides, and tabourines and cymbals hung against their cedar columns from top to bottom. Women were sleeping stretched on mats outside the cells. Their bodies were greasy with unguents, and exhaled an odour of spices and extinguished perfuming pans, while they were so covered with tattooings, necklaces, rings, vermilion, and antimony that, but for the motion of their breasts, they might have been taken for idols as they lay thus on the ground. There were lotus trees encircling a fountain in which fish like Salammbôs were swimming, and then in the background, against the wall of the temple, spread a vine, the branches of which were of glass, and the grape bunches of emerald, the rays from the precious stones making a play of light through the painted columns upon the sleeping faces. Matho felt suffocated in the warm atmosphere pressed down upon him by the cedar partitions. All these symbols of fecundation, these perfumes, radiations, and breathings overwhelmed him. Through all the mystic dazzling he kept thinking of Salammbô. She became confused with the goddess herself, and his love unfolded itself all the more, like the great lotus plants blooming upon the depths of the waters. Spendius was calculating how much money he would have made in former days by the sale of these women, and with a rapid glance he estimated the weight of the golden necklaces as he passed by. The temple was impenetrable on this side as on the other, and they returned behind the first chamber. While Spendius was searching and ferreting, Matho was prostrate before the door supplicating Tanith. He besought her not to permit the sacrilege, and strove to soften her with caressing words, such as are used to an angry person. Spendius noticed a narrow aperture above the door. "Rise," he said to Matho, and he made him stand erect with his back against the wall. Placing one foot in his hands, and then the other upon his head, he reached up to the air-hole, made his way into it, and disappeared. Then Matho felt a knotted cord, that one which Spendius had rolled around his body before entering the cisterns, fall upon his shoulders, and bearing upon it with both hands, he soon found himself by the side of the other in a large hall filled with shadow. Such an attempt was something extraordinary. The inadequacy of the means for preventing it was a sufficient proof that it was considered impossible. The sanctuaries were protected by terror more than by their walls. Matho expected to die at every step. However, a light was flickering far back in the darkness, and they went up to it. It was a lamp burning in a shell on the pedestal of a statue, which wore the cap of the Kabiri. Its long blue robe was strewn with diamond discs, and its heels were fastened to the ground by chains, which sank beneath the pavement. Matho suppressed a cry. "Ah, there she is! There she is!" he stammered out. Spendius took up the lamp in order to light himself. "What an impious man you are!" murmured Matho, following him nevertheless. The apartment which they entered had nothing in it but a black painting representing another woman. Her legs reached to the top of the wall, and her body filled the entire ceiling. A huge egg hung by a thread from her navel, and she fell head downwards upon the other wall, reaching as far as the level of the pavement, which was touched by her pointed fingers. They drew a hanging aside in order to go on further, but the wind blew and the light went out. Then they wandered about, lost in the complications of the architecture. Suddenly they felt something strangely soft beneath their feet. Sparks crackled and leaped. They were walking in fire. Spendius touched the ground and perceived that it was carefully carpeted with lynx skins. Then it seemed to them that a big cord, wet, cold, and vicious, was gliding between their legs. Through some fissures cut in the wall there fell thin white rays, and they advanced by this uncertain light. At last they distinguished a large black serpent. It darted quickly away and disappeared. "Let us fly!" exclaimed Matho. "It is she! I feel her! She is coming!" "No, no," replied Spendius. "The temple is empty." Then a dazzling light made them lower their eyes. Next they perceived all around them an infinite number of beasts, lean, panting, with bristling claws, and mingled together one above another in a mysterious and terrifying confusion. There were serpents with feet, and bulls with wings, fishes with human heads were devouring fruit, flowers were blooming in the jaws of crocodiles, and elephants with uplifted trunks were sailing proudly through the azure like eagles. Their incomplete or multiplied limbs were distended with terrible exertion. As they thrust out their tongues, they looked as though they would fain give forth their souls, and every shape was to be found among them, as if the germ receptacle had been suddenly hatched and had burst, emptying itself upon the walls of the hall. Round the latter were 12 globes of blue crystal, supported by monsters resembling tigers. Their eyeballs were starting out of their heads like those of snails. With their dumpy loins bent, they were turning around towards the background where their supreme rabbit, the omnifecund, the last invented, shone splendid in a chariot of ivory. She was covered with scales, feathers, flowers, and birds as high as the waist. For earrings she had silver cymbals, which flapped against her cheeks. Her large fixed eyes gazed upon you, and a luminous stone, set in an obscure symbol on her brow, lightened the whole hall by its reflection in red copper mirrors above the door. Matho stood a step forward, but a flagstone yielded beneath his heels, and immediately the spheres began to revolve, and the monsters to roar. Music rose melodious and pealing, like the harmony of the planets. The tumultuous soul of Tanith was poured streaming forth. She was about to arise as lofty as the hall and with open arms. Suddenly the monsters closed their jaws and the crystal globes revolved no more. Then a mournful modulation lingered for a time through the air and at last died away. "And the veil?" said Spendius. Nowhere could it be seen. Where was it to be found? How could it be discovered? What if the priests had hidden it? Matho experienced anguish of heart and felt as though he had been deceived in his belief. "This way," whispered Spendius. An inspiration guided him. He drew Matho behind Tanith's chariot, where a cleft a cubit wide ran down the wall from top to bottom. Then they penetrated into a small and completely circular room, so lofty that it was like the interior of a pillar. In the centre there was a big black stone of semispherical shape, like a tambourine. Flames were burning upon it, an ebony cone, bearing a head and 2 arms, rose behind. But beyond it seemed as though there were a cloud wherein were twinkling stars, faces appeared in the depths of its folds, Eshmaun with the Kabiri, some of the monsters that had already been seen, the sacred beasts of the Babylonians, and others with which they were not acquainted. It passed beneath the idol's face like a mantle, and spread fully out was drawn up on the wall, to which it was fastened by the corners, appearing at once bluish as the night, yellow as the dawn, purple as the sun, multitudinous, diaphanous, sparkling light. It was the mantle of the goddess, the holy zaïmph which might not be seen. Both turned pale. "Take it," said Matho at last. Spendius did not hesitate, and leaning upon the idol he unfastened the veil, which sank to the ground. Matho laid his hand upon it, then he put his head through the opening, then he wrapped it around his body, and he spread out his arms the better to view it. "Let us go," said Spendius. Matho stood panting with his eyes fixed upon the pavement. Suddenly he exclaimed: "But what if I went to her? I fear her beauty no longer. What could she do to me? I am now more than a man. I could pass through flames or walk upon the sea. I am transported. Salammbô, Salammbô, I am your master." His voice was like thunder. He seemed to Spendius to have grown taller and transformed. End of chapter 5, part 1.